Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. We are incredibly excited to be here with you today, and I'm incredibly excited and honored to be joined up here by these three amazing individuals. We have heard a lot about innovation today. The word has been mentioned quite a bit this afternoon, and I'm incredibly excited, too, that it's the second year in a row that this topic is the topic of this amazing event. So we're going to dive right in, and the first question that I want to ask everyone, because we're all coming today from different aspects of innovation and different ways that we see innovation and experience it during our day-to-day jobs, and I'm sure that you're all coming from your own perspectives as well, is I'd love to hear from you three just how you interact with that on a day-to-day basis, what it means to you, and why you think it's important.
So that's great. I believe that innovation is very much driven by culture. Be it at a large corporation, be it at a city or a startup, I believe that it's all about the culture and the people and how you're capturing those ideas and how you're bringing them into some fruition.
Yeah, so I invest in startups, so I really believe that this is among the best times to be an innovator and an upstart and a disruptor. But that also means that it's among the most dangerous times to be an incumbent. And there's a great opportunity for incumbents to embrace that. A number of the things that Judge Hidalgo or the mayor, even Scott mentioned, that are things that are going on in the city here, not just companies, but infrastructurally. Transportation is being transformed in many ways, but fundamentally, many of the new transportation paradigms are being enabled by technology-enabled companies. So I think that innovation to us is not just a means to an end for business, but really an opportunity to transform businesses.
Yeah, and I think, so I work with cities across the country, and I think when we think about innovation, we need to think about authenticity. And it's really about the underlying strengths of that city and evolving that and progressing it into what will be the next invention for that city. So it's not trying to be some other city, it's trying to be what is authentic about Houston and innovating on your core strengths to progress, to get more people to Saturn and another planet.
Yeah. So Kate, I actually want to start with you for our first question, because your firm, HR&A, you essentially fuel economic development in communities largely through a lot of placemaking activities. And so my question for you, you've done projects for the co-working space behemoth WeWork, you've done a New York City tech ecosystem study and an innovation district roadmap for the University of Georgia. And I'm really curious, how do those communities come to you? What do they identify as being a driver behind wanting to do this type of study or this type of work in the first place? And what are some of the strategies that you employed to help them accomplish what they want to accomplish, and what do those outcomes look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think so these types of places either evolve organically because you have a brand university like MIT and you have a subway station there, and you then evolve and you have land, right? And that's kind of how Kendall Square evolved. Or they're created by brute force and will by the key stakeholders of the city, because they realize that their future, be it hospital, university, just institutions of the city, their future is tied to the strength and competitiveness of that city. And so in a place like St. Louis, where they got together, or in North Carolina, Research Triangle Park, they knew that their place was not going to remain competitive unless they got together and created these places to encourage new business development, to encourage their existing businesses to think differently, to create a place where talent wants to be so that new businesses will come and event. And that's what's so exciting about what's happening in Houston, that there's this collective force realizing we want to push Houston forward. We are a great city. We have amazing strengths. We are inventing lots of amazing things. And let's just keep moving forward as a whole city and creating all of that infrastructure and resources for innovators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Tig, I actually want to go to you next, because as we're on the topic of place, you invest in startup companies, it's no secret that the majority of the venture capital going into startups is going into California-based startups, right? But Revolution has a really different approach to that, and I'm sure in some of the communities that Kate was just mentioning are some of the communities that you have invested in. And so can you talk a little bit more about Revolution, your thesis, and the bus tour as well, because that's a fun piece.
Yeah, sure. So Revolution's a little bit unique in that we've really built a firm on investing outside of the places where venture capital typically had been historically deployed. So something like 75% of venture capital is invested in California, New York, Boston, but over 75% of the Fortune 500 companies are headquartered elsewhere. And as technology has been emancipated and the bar has been lowered in terms of establishing ecosystems, it's become much easier for companies to be started outside these locations that historically really needed a corpus of engineers, even the accounting and law firms, things that were set up, the things that sort of made Silicon Valley what it is. So we started Revolution 15 years ago. I co-founded it with the AOL founder, Steve Case. And we put it in DC for no other reason than that's where we were. And we knew we were going to have to hop on airplanes and travel in order to build companies. And we decided to sort of try to fight above our weight and not compete with the folks who were incumbents in these areas, but take advantage of these trends. 15 years later, I think we've really built sort of one of, if not the leading brands that is focused on making investments outside of Silicon Valley. And it's been, knock on wood, not just something that we think is important, but it's, we've continued to be a top-performing fund or a top-performing series of funds. So I think there's economic muscle behind that. But it's not something that has happened without intention. So, we spend our days investing in these companies, et cetera, but we've also really worked hard at putting a spotlight on these opportunities. So Steve Case, we're from DC, not a great place to be in this crowd, although I will say I was at the game tonight or last night, and I've emailed every one of my friends from Houston because it was the most gracious crowd I've ever been around. I mean, that would not have been the same if it were a Yankees game. So thank you. And I will say one other thing. The Reverend here is a man of God, but he's a man of Houston first, because when he came down, I asked him to pray for the Nationals, and he refused to do that. Anyway, so we're based in DC, and one thing that we really understand is sort of how political campaigns work. So we've essentially built bus tours that look like campaign bus tours. And every 6 months, we pick 5 cities that we think are really emerging. We put Steve on a bus, and he really rides the bus. We roll it out there. We convene thought leaders, folks like you who represent the local ecosystems. We bring in government leaders, et cetera, and we really try to put a spotlight on it. That's not something, obviously there's a benefit to us, but it's not something we do just because of us. It's something that we do because we think it's a big opportunity. So that's a little bit about Revolution.
Okay, Worley, you're next. So we talked a lot about community with both Kate and Tig. Now I want to talk about corporations, because you have quite a bit of experience working in them and with them as it relates to innovation. And so talk a little bit about the work that you do around innovation with corporations and how you help these companies think about their products and their services and what they're delivering into the community, to think not only, what do we need to do right now to stay ahead, but generations ahead.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, most of the time that I travel around the country and around the world, it's because I'm the startup guy and all the corporations want to have that startup DNA. And you hear a lot about this. Like, we want to inject that startup DNA into the company. We want to do these things. And what I often tell corporations, what I often find to be the case is it's not that the corporation is not being innovative. It's that it's starving innovation out internally. And Microsoft, having just released their earnings yesterday, is an amazing example of this. For the last 20 years, you could look at Microsoft and you could probably say they had Windows and Office and they kind of had their products and they didn't really do anything, right? And what Satya has done in there is he's come in and he said, well, that doesn't mean that there's not innovation going on. Our engineers are starting side companies and doing other projects and volunteering, and they've kind of taken it and transformed the culture, which again, culture is key. into an organization where they're now letting that innovation breathe within that organization. I often tell corporations it's a difference between reaction and response. One is voluntary and the other is not. And I see all of the time when I listen in on meetings, you see somebody come in and they have an idea, and the response of the manager is not to say, hey, that's great, this is how we can help fulfill that vision you have and help integrate it into the company and provide you a career path. It's a reaction that's just a knee-jerk of like, well, we don't do that, or focus on the thing we're focused on. If you want to be innovative, you by default will cannibalize the existing lines of business you have in some way or some form. I mean, that is a fact. And so you have companies that are very good at that, and you have companies that are very bad at that. The examples run rampant, but it's really about the culture. We live in the greatest time to be alive ever. I mean, I can remember when I was young having to cut UPC codes out of cereal boxes and ride my bike to the post office, and maybe 6 to 8 to 12 weeks later, I got a little piece of electronics and a kit on how I could try to build something. And my 3-year-old can go on Amazon and have like web services and a computer and everything he needs delivered in like 2 hours by Prime. So it's an amazing time.
Only his son, 3 years
It's
old.
amazing. It's an amazing time to be alive. And so there is no excuse for you as a startup or a corporation or a government or a city to not be innovating. It is literally all around you. You just have to become a participant in the system and make sure that you have a culture that supports those people that are trying to take that risk.
Are there any specific as it relates to really driving that culture forward, are there any specific things that you've seen certain companies do really well or not so well as it relates to fostering that in the first place?
Absolutely. Look, I have a list of things I tell corporations, and it's funny because I can't believe people still have me come out, whether it's in my startup role or my role at Ecliptic Capital at the fund, they're always asking the same questions, and the answer has not changed, right? You want to have certain principles. You want to be able to respond to opportunities, not react, right? You want to be able to influence things, not control them. You don't want to put all these tight, restrictions around your employees. Google is a great example that very early said, we're going to give you 20% of your time to work on whatever you want, because they recognized that innovation was going to be going on. The difference is if you're trying to control it and constrain it too much, you not only choke the innovation out of the organization, but more importantly, you miss out on these opportunities. They're happening, right? You need to be aware, and they're happening in the city, they're happening in the corporations. So there's a whole set of rules they can follow, but at the main point, it's about culture. The thing I see, the only difference is you either have a culture that's innovative or you don't. And if you don't, it's either because you don't want it, right? It's a business that is long tail and they don't want to change. If there's no need, if it's not broke, there's no need to repair it. Or you're not doing the right things because it's risky. And the thing that I always hear from corporations is, entrepreneurship, we want intrapreneurship, right? We want our corporation to be like entrepreneurs. The word is French, and the word means the person who takes the risk. And so if you're not going to allow for a culture and an environment that celebrates the risk, that provides the safety nets for people to take those chances, then you're not going to get to the point of innovation you want to be.
So Kate, just as innovation poses both opportunities but also risks and challenges for corporations, the same is true for cities, which you have a lot of experience working within. So thinking about, just how innovation has affected us so far with ride sharing, food delivery, Instagram, I'm sure all of these things are things that you're keeping in the back of your mind as you're working within a community and trying to placemake. So how do you factor innovation and these new trends in and make sure that you're working with and not against those factors as you're doing your job?
Yeah, I think there's people who chase products and shiny things. And all of those things are going to change over time, right? And then there's people who think about, well, who is actually in that place? The commonality is people. I like to tell a story that in New York, when the RFP went out for Hudson Yards, which just opened, the iPhone did not even exist. So creating places take time. You don't know what those innovations are going to be. But what you do know is that people and people's desire to be around each other, people's desire to learn and interact and produce and support their families will continue. And that's what you have to think about when you're designing these places.
Yeah. Worley, I'm coming back to you. So in the announcement for your Equals program, which I'm hoping you can share just a little bit on, I'm going to read a quote that you said in the press release. So I've been an advocate of the widespread access to information and technologies my entire career. These technologies have the power to change lives, reinvent industries, and create entire new economies. Women and girls play a vital role and are fundamental to an ecosystem of innovation. Gender equality must be the focus of the technology industry if we are to continue to innovate in the future. What steps can Houston as a community, and even walking out of this room, all of us today, take in order to really take that to heart? And how does that elevate Houston by doing so?
That's a great question. So I had a very skewed career. When I worked at Apple, my boss was a woman. Her boss was a woman. My boss's boss was a woman. And it's just a very progressive company. And I left Apple and I went to IBM. And I was like, I work for a bunch more women. And then I went to a meeting about the title of the thing was the issue of women in tech. And I was like, I know, right? They have taken over. Like, I am never gonna get into management, clearly. And they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, and so I just had this so it was only when I went to that I started realizing, basically, in technology, it tends to be male, it tends to be white male, it tends to not do this. And as I travel around the world, working with the entrepreneurship program at CERN that we founded, working with the UN and UN Women and stuff, you start seeing innovation in all these different environments, right? And you start seeing this benefit of cross-populating all of that. And so I think, for a city to really be able to take advantage of that, it's like, one, participating in programs like Equals is great. Equals was not, though, as Kate said, things don't just happen overnight. We were invited for a British Airways flight where they took 100 innovators and we did a hackathon in the air, flying from California to London to present at the G8. And as I like to say, it was 98 of the world's greatest innovators, Craig Newmark and me. But we went through, thank both of you, appreciate that. It's like Rick and Morty. Those ladies get it, they get it. But basically, we started a program for women, and we found that it was incredibly hard. It failed. It was called Advisor. We had some of the best women, Kimberly from Black Girls Code and Susan Black and everybody, and I was the only guy on the team. It was amazing, and it didn't go anywhere because it's very hard to make that shift in thinking in a corporation or a city or in any organization. Not that people don't want to do it. It's just sometimes you're trying to force opportunities where they're not. You haven't created things. And so what we tried to do with Equals was, instead of having, again, this control versus influence and kind of controlling that environment, we tried to bring organizations from around the world together to participate. And so when I look at Houston, I see an incredibly diverse culture. It's one of the biggest cities in the nation, one of the biggest cities in the world. It has all of this potential. I think it's really about elevating those people that are doing well, and a younger and younger age. Like, you don't want to just say, like, well, we need to have diversity, so that's 3 women managers. It's like, I guarantee you, in the city, in the corporations, there are tons of people, women, minorities, et cetera, that are already doing amazing things. And sometimes they're doing it very early and sometimes very low level. So it's really about giving voice to that and giving an equal opportunity for that to be something that comes up in the workplace and then is rewarded, right? The risk-taking. It is a huge issue for me because I now have had the experience of talking to literally, thousands and thousands of people around the world. There are 480 organizations that participate in Equals. Doreen Bogdan is a great example. She is the first elected official in the UNITU in 153 years that is a woman. And that's kind of insane just statistically, right? Like, if you just think about it, you would have thought sometime in 153 years there would have been a woman, since the organization, by the way, is 70% women, that would have rose to leadership, right? That just makes sense. So I think it's really about giving voice and providing that opportunity, but not placating to it, right? And not, it has to be genuine. And there's so many amazing women in tech that I work with every day. And like, they're definitely there. They're definitely in the company. They're definitely in the city. It's incredibly important to bring that out and just provide kind of that platform. And again, not to harp on culture, that comes back to culture. It comes back to the culture of the leadership. It comes back to the culture of the organization.
Yeah. Based on the discussion today and some of the announcements that were made, I think it's pretty clear that the culture of the leadership in this city is really embracing that and fostering it. So thank you.
Which is awesome.
And that goes to some of the remarks that Scott was making earlier, just about this innovation corridor that's being created here. And so, Tig, you know, you go to a bunch of different communities across the country. You're seeing, you know, lots of different assets that each of these communities has. We talked about one of the assets here being some of the innovation that's happened to date around space technology, clean tech, health tech. How can Houston leverage these legacy industries? Or maybe, you know, it's not necessarily leveraging those legacy industries, but what do you think that Houston needs to be focusing on in order to bring more of that venture capital, more of that innovation, more talent here?
Well, listen, it would be presumptuous of me to say what Houston should or shouldn't do. But I can talk about some things that are in common, you know, in places that we do see vibrant communities developing. One is not necessarily being the Silicon of X. You know, we see a lot of companies that early on describe themselves as the Uber of X or the, you know, and what that oftentimes really indicates is it's a company that's searching for its product market fit, hasn't really described it yet, so it's looking for some kind of analogy. Whereas once these local ecosystems really get some footing, it's not really the Silicon X, it's that thing. And a major contributor to that, and unfortunately there's no silver bullet to it, but I can give a couple of examples, is a big local success. So if, Indianapolis, for example, had a company called ExactTarget. It was this little software company, ultimately became a reasonably big software company, started by some local Indianapolis folks, and it was bought by Salesforce for, you know, a couple $1 billion. That was a huge transformational thing for Indianapolis, not just because Salesforce bought a company and all of a sudden the tallest building in Indianapolis now says Salesforce on it, but because the people who built that company didn't leave. And they started providing mentorship. They started providing sort of software or startup assistance. They put capital into those businesses, but it also gave the local community, my guess is similar to the folks around here, something to point to, right? There were these direct things that came out of it, the mentorship, but also, but there's the indirect ones, which is said, you know what, we can have another one of those ExactTargets. I mean, Revolution is totally a product of a bunch of people who came to DC and were not originally from DC because we built this thing called AOL, and then, you know, that thing went away, but a bunch of people stuck around. So it's hard to say, like, what does Houston need to do to have success, other than to liberate these people and celebrate them. Because success begets success. And then also what happens is you start getting this, the people in these companies have a taste, right? They've been in entrepreneurial businesses and they've decided that they want to give that a try. And there's an ecosystem that, you know, the founders of the prior companies put a little money in them, and all of a sudden you have a significant sort of seeding of the ground. So those are things that we've often found in common in these companies. And there's, as I said, there's no silver bullet, but there is a psychology of sort of embracing that's necessary for success there.
And I would just add to that the psychology aspect of it. I don't think they're legacy industries. They're the strengths of Houston, and that's where the innovation is going to come from. And we have to figure out how to set them up for success for the next generation, be it places, be it empowering the workforce, be it just figuring out how we can diversify the workforce and give them the tools to succeed and encouraging that opportunity. But it's not about being something else. It's about being authentic to what Houston is really good at.
Yeah, I mean, tagging on to that, being from Austin, everybody, in tech in Austin thinks Houston is about just energy, right? And that's it. And maybe that's the case, and that would be okay. There is so much innovation that has happened in the energy industry that has built Houston. It is a super innovative industry, regardless of any of your biases against or for it or whatever. And you're exactly right. There is already a ton of innovation going on. It's not necessarily about trying to transform it into something new, but rather to build off the foundation that you already have.
What are some of the ways that you've seen policymakers in the various communities that you've worked within help cheerlead and celebrate that kind of activity?
I mean, there's a couple things, right? It's figuring out how to lower the barrier of entry to take risk. And that is ensuring you have the skills to be able to do that. So really reinforcing our education system and workforce development, introducing computer science in K through 12, and the like. It's also setting up funds and giving people access to money and resources. So whether it's labs, whether it's low-cost office space, and it's also setting up competitions and a culture for creating and doing. And that's what's really exciting about what's happening in Houston, what's happening in Midtown at the Ion, and what's happening at the Launchpad. Houston is putting that infrastructure in place to encourage people to try and test and become entrepreneurs.
As we're talking about infrastructure and continuing to build around innovation and support innovation, Ty, your fund provides a lot more than just money. Talk to us a little bit how, using that as a microcosm of what Houston or any community across the country could do to help support innovation. How do you support your portfolio companies beyond the cash?
Yeah, so you're right. There's a lot of cash in the venture capital business, more and more cash. So that's really table stakes. It's sort of the price of entry. It's not really a differentiator, and it hasn't been for quite some time. For us, and there probably are some analogies. There are a couple of areas. So our approach is a little different than most venture capital firms that have that invest in lots and lots of things, see which one sprouts up, and sort of jettison the ones that don't, and focus on the ones that are promising. We typically make fewer investments, more concentrated, and that means that our success rate has to be higher on those. And in order to do that, we are very focused on working closely with those companies, and the things that we do and the kinds of things that folks around this room could be extremely helpful with are bringing expertise to the table. So there's been a lot of talk about some of the transportation innovation that'll be necessary to the next generation of success in Houston. Well, if you think about the things that are driving a lot of that, I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of it's tech-driven. So we had this sort of macro thesis a long time ago that transportation was going to transform. We invested in this company, I don't know, a dozen years ago, something like that, before people were investing in rental car companies. And it was an idea. We sort of came up with this idea, put it together. It ultimately became this company called Zipcar, which essentially, once people had little computers in their pocket, this utopian hippie dream of sharing cars all of a sudden was not, subjugated just the utopian hippies. But we needed to sort of bring that to mainstream. So we built a board that really helped impact this idea to transform. We brought in a management team with real expertise from big places like GM and Carrie Limousine, et cetera, who had some expertise, but then surrounded them with great engineers. And then we brought in Lee Iacocca and put him on the board. And the job of Lee Iacocca, so Lee Iacocca, many know, he's the chairman of Chrysler and invented the Ford Mustang. His job was to open doors and put a spotlight on a concept that was scary to people otherwise and make it acceptable, just as he did elsewhere. We brought in the one guy who'd been the only CEO of both Avis and Hertz, and he brought some sort of managerial expertise. And this is sort of in the very early days of sort of NetJets and things like that. There was one company that had fractionalized NetJets, which is flying around in jets, from into by the hour. And that's what we were trying to do for cars. And that expertise enabled management to open doors, have a little bit of experience, and move forward. And that was really the first generation of the sharing economy. And that ushered in things like Uber, et cetera. And it would have been possible without sort of established great folks around the table to give the management teams the leeway to be successful, but also to lend to them the value of their traditional expertise.
Yeah, and I want to tag on that right quick. I know we're about to close, but I want to say something to the audience. I'll speak directly to you. My long-term friend, Mike Irwin, has just launched a new fund called Ecliptic Capital that I'm part of. And what really got me excited was Mike's thesis, because there is a lot of capital in the world. There's not a lot of capital in Texas, right? So we still need the capital in addition to the expertise. California will get 70+ billion of investment this year, as you were noting. New York, over 14, 2 in Texas. We have as many Fortune 500 companies. We have great university systems. We have an amazing entrepreneurial ecosystem. We have 4 of the top 10 largest cities in the world in a 3.5-hour radius. And so I think it's important to note that while there is a lot of capital and abundance in the world, we are still lacking. Capital still needed in Austin and Houston and San Antonio and Dallas, for sure. And so I think that it's the right capital, and you want that attention. But I think we need to make sure that all things are about a balance. That we still, just because Houston has these successful projects doesn't mean we don't need to put capital into Houston, right? There's a lot of opportunity for the capital and the expertise.
Right. Well, before they start playing the music over us, I want to say thank you so much to the 3 of you for joining us. Thank you, Bob, for having us here, and thank all of you.
We have a little gift here for everybody. And Tig, we just want to show you how incredibly gracious we are, okay? We'll make you an honorary Astro, Tig.
If you watch a game tomorrow night, he'll be right behind home plate. And so I'm going to challenge him to wear the Astros kit tomorrow so we can all see him on national TV right behind home plate.
That is a serious challenge.
Okay. Thank you to you, and thank you to all of you. Go Astros.
That's great.